Thursday, June the 6th, will see the start of a unique election. In Europe, millions of voters will go to the polls, not to choose their national governments, but to send representatives to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. This will have major implications not only for relationships between European countries, but also for the continent's role on the world stage. These elections are taking place on a continent that has changed profoundly since the last European elections of May 2019. Since then, the United Kingdom has left the European Union, and the continent has weathered a global pandemic. However, many issues continue to loom large over European politics: migration, the effects of climate change, economic uncertainty, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and, of course, the war in Gaza. The choices that European voters will make look set to shape the domestic and foreign policies of one of the world's most important political and economic blocs. Although turnout in some previous European elections has been low, with less than a week to go, forecasters are anticipating more engagement this time in what promises to be a turning point for the continent. Welcome to the Year of Elections, a podcast series brought to you by the Opinion Desk at The National. I'm Declan McVeigh, staff opinion writer at The National, speaking to you from our studio here in Abu Dhabi, and this week we're looking at the European elections. I'm joined by Sunniva Rose, The National's correspondent in Brussels, and Professor Justin Gibbons in Dubai, to understand how the elections are unfolding. Sunniva, if I could turn to you first. For those listeners who may be unfamiliar with the EU elections process, would you give us a quick rundown of how many countries and voters will be taking part, how national parties group themselves in the European Parliament after the election, and really who are the main players that we should be keeping an eye on?
There are 27 countries in the European Union, which means that more than 370 million voters will be able to vote. That's more than in the US 2 years ago, for example. And they will be choosing the next 720 European Parliament members. What's so special about this election is that it's the only place in the world where people from several countries vote for a single parliament. And countries are allocated a number of seats depending on their size. So, for example, the countries with the most seats at the next election will be Germany, then France, then Italy. The voting takes place over 3 days between June the 6th and June the 9th, and most countries will be voting on the last day. Currently, the European Parliament is dominated by the centre-right European People's Party and the Socialist Group. And polls show that the right and far right are likely to progress in the next election. That means that policies that were, for example, more friendly towards nature conservation and that dominated the last parliament and commission are going to people are going to lose interest in that kind of stuff. And now they want a tougher stance on migration, industry, security. So, for example, the Greens could lose seats, the centre could lose seats, and socialists could lose a few seats as well. It's important to look at the composition of the European Parliament because they'll decide who is going to be in the next commission with the next president and its 26 commissioners, which are kind of like a European government. And the current president, Ursula von der Leyen, wants a second term. She's become a familiar face in Europe, especially with the war in Ukraine. She's been very pro-Ukraine. And she's also come under a bit of fire, though, for her pro-environmental policies from the far right. So it's unclear if she'll be able to stay on or not. Everyone right now is trying to guess what the next alliances are going to be like, but at this stage, honestly, nobody really knows. Far-right Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni hopes to create a new majority in Parliament. We'll see how it goes. But after MEPs are elected, they'll be elected for 5 years. They'll mostly be working on laws that are first drafted by the Commission, but that then they can influence significantly as co-legislators. And they also have a final vote on the laws. But because they can't actually propose themselves any laws, they're viewed as the weakest of the three EU institutions.
I think that your reference to the rise of the far-right parties is interesting, and I want to bring Justin in here. I mean, Justin, a lot of your research has focused on issues of national identity, and I think given the many credible predictions from the European Council on Foreign Relations and others of major gains by populist or nationalist or far-right parties, do you think we are seeing a resurgence of national identity among European voters and a moving away from the EU project and its values?
I think to a certain extent, yes. National identity issues, they never really go away because they're seen as being the focus of protecting the national interests of nation states. And you do see a lot of changes happening within that national identity. You have a core element of national identity, which is very much underpins ideas about what the nation is, what the state is, and so on, its history and culture and so on. But you also get kind of changes. And you get changes because some people feel that national issues, such as green issues, are important, and then they feel that they can link that in to other parties and other groups that have similar such concerns throughout Europe, as of course we see with the European Green Party. So the first part of the answer is really that, in a way, national identity doesn't really go away, but it's certainly kind of always there, but it changes depending on the context and some of the threats happening. But the second thing about national identity, of course, it tends to spike when threats appear on the horizon. And I think very much in relation to what Sunniva just said about immigration issues, particularly illegal immigration, I think that puts national identity issues very much in the forefront of voters' minds. So I think when you come to threat factors, I think in relation to possibly Russia and Ukraine, particularly, of course, issues in relation to immigration, then national identity does become more of an attractive option to defend for voters.
Sunniva, I think, in your very comprehensive presentation of the elections process here, I think you really did a good job at showing what's at stake. There's a lot to play for. I think a lot depends on voter turnout and what happens next. The last EU elections in May 2019 saw 50.7% of voters cast a ballot, which was the highest participation in 20 years. I think a recent survey from Eurobarometer suggested that 60% of Europeans say they are interested in these elections, which is an increase since 2019. From your perspective from Brussels, what do you think that this likely high turnout says about the concerns of European voters?
Well, it's quite difficult to measure how interested people are in national politics and in European issues. For example, in France, the country I know best, the party that's the most popular right now is Marine Le Pen's National Front. And they've really said that people should be voting against Emmanuel Macron, the president who is a centrist. So they've made this all about national politics, really. But it depends on each country's internal dynamics. But there's a general trend that people are mostly concerned across Europe, mostly about the economy, inflation, social inequalities. And I think, as Justin says, that creates fears as well against the other. And immigration is also one of these big topics. And the economy in Europe is slowing down. We have heavyweights like Germany and France that have very closely and narrowly avoided a recession last year. And even though maybe some countries like Portugal, they have, let's say, relatively low unemployment at 7%, salaries are low, and people have to work many jobs. So there's a general feeling, I think, of fear and anxiety, especially among the youth, that might trigger people to vote, but for many reasons in June. As I said, a mixture of European concerns and national concerns.
You just touched upon there the youth vote, and this is something I wanted to ask Justin about. I mean, Justin, you work in academia, you work with young people on European issues. I was wondering, do you think younger Europeans are poised to play more of a deciding role this time around, or do you think they'll be susceptible to the kind of apathy we've seen in previous elections?
I think young voters they tend to have perhaps more political activism or political assertion, particularly individuals who are becoming 18 for the first time. And this is the first times that they can actually exercise their democratic responsibility to vote. So I think there certainly may well be a kind of interest for young voters to kind of be very active in the forthcoming European elections. This kind of takes place against a backdrop of the fact that some of the 27 members have had historically high voting records across the board. You find that with Belgium and Luxembourg, for example, and then some other countries like Slovakia, Slovenia, they have quite a low turnout of only between 20 and 30%. So I think this impacts on kind of young voters as well. But I think the one area within which young voters will be particularly motivated is, of course, green issues. And I think political parties like the European Green Party, and whether or not young voters feel that their own national parties are protecting the environment in the way that those young voters wish, that will also have an impact on their desire to come out and vote. So I think certainly young voters will have an influence, but it takes place against the context of other kind of voting records in relation to the member states.
Indeed. Justin, if we could just stay with you for a moment, but also take a step back and look at European politics on the global stage. Last month, Sunniva reported comments from Emmanuel Macron, President of France, who said Europe was at a tipping point and could die because of its faltering international role. Do you think these elections could reverse this perceived waning influence, Or might the result lead to a more inward-looking Fortress Europe type mentality?
I think the Fortress Europe kind of mentality will depend very much on how far-right parties do, particularly groups like the Identity and Democracy Party. But I think as a general rule, it's always been one of those areas, the common foreign security policy of the European Union, which became one of the three pillars in 1993 after Maastricht. It's always been one of the weaker areas. You find a lot of fragmented responses in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even on broader foreign policy issues. For example, in relation to Israel's war against Hamas, you find a number of European Union member states who have very recently recognized Palestine as an independent state, Spain, Norway, Ireland. But you've also got a lot of other European Union countries, despite the fact that they argue that the two-state solution is the most viable option, have yet to recognize an independent Palestine. So I still think crafting a common foreign security policy in dealing with regional threats to Europe and even global issues, I still think the European Union has a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on the Middle East there, and obviously for the three of us, we're looking at these elections from a Middle East perspective. And certainly the war in Gaza has brought the issue of Palestine to the top of the agenda. I mean, even in cultural terms, we saw the furore that surrounded Israel's participation in the Eurovision Song Contest recently. Sunniva, I'd like to ask you, what role do you think Europe's response to the Gaza crisis will play in this election? And how might a more right-wing, Eurocentric parliament approach the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in general?
Well, I think that we maybe tend to overestimate the importance of the conflict as a preoccupation for Europeans. At least, for example, in France, the far left has tried very hard to pick up on the Gaza war and in what analysts describe as an attempt to attract votes from people of North African origin. But if you look at polls, what the most important topics for the French, for example, today is still the economy and immigration. Foreign affairs comes quite low. Even Ukraine comes quite low as a subject of preoccupation. So at least analysts I spoke to told me that they think it's a bit of a risky move by the far left to bank so much on people's concern on Gaza. And this despite the fact that we've seen strong mobilization in universities in favor of Palestine and protests and a lot of political debate around this. It doesn't mean automatically that people will be thinking about that when they vote in June. So I think obviously it's just polls right now, and we have to see how it moves forward. When it comes to the actual European Parliament, as Justin said, European countries are incredibly divided over this. And so far, it really remains a national sovereign issue. So the European Parliament is not as involved in this as more at the European Council level, where we see big players like Germany and other countries like the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia being really cautious about appearing in any way critical of Israel. And this, I think, is likely to continue, if not become stronger in the following months.
Justin, turning to you again, and I'd like to return to the issue of the likely gains made by right-wing parties in the coming election. I find it interesting that at least one such government in Europe, that of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, has shown itself to be somewhat more pragmatic than its opponents initially suggested. Do you think that a similarly right-wing contenders from France, Germany, and other key EU states will prove to be equally businesslike when they're actually ensconced in Strasbourg?
I think one thing about the Brothers of Italy party, which of course is headed by Giorgia Meloni, is of course all political parties function within their own kind of ideological framework. But I think what Giorgia Meloni has done is exactly as you said, tried to create that kind of pragmatic link to other functionaries within the EU, well, particularly Ursula von der Leyen on a personal level, and with other EU member states. So I think from an ideological point of view, you do see some fundamental differences between Giorgia Meloni's party and, of course, the ECR that she represents, the European Conservative and Reformists, as distinct from some other what are classified as far-right groups. You see differences in her approach and the approach of her party in terms of their attitudes towards Russia and Ukraine. You find other far-right groups like the National Rally Party of France, who seem to exhibit far more sympathy to the Russian side of affairs, whereas Giorgia Meloni has fairly consistently kind of supported Ukraine. Within Eurosceptic discourses, Giorgia Meloni seems to be more of a kind of soft Eurosceptic, within which she peddles or supports the idea of kind of EU reform, whereas some of the other groups that are classed as far right, Austrian Freedom Party or the Geert Wilders Dutch Freedom Party, tend to be much more hard Eurosceptics. So I think despite perhaps some of the press categorization of Brothers of Italy Party being far right, I think she's been a little bit more successful at maneuvering it to being part of a kind of like right of centre mainstream, as distinct from some of the other far right groups, which I think are probably more difficult to deal with when they come into coalitions.
I mean, I suppose I want to get your opinion on, do you think such parties can actually work together once they've risen to power? I mean, we've already seen something of a split between France's National Rally and the Alternative for Deutschland, who they're apparently not cooperating anymore. Do you think these parties can actually pull together and push European politics in a more rightward direction?
Can do, but not necessarily the Brothers of Italy Party and hard right groups. I think hard right groups will find more ideological groundwork and common practices, common beliefs between themselves. They'll be more united over their response about having a greater level of sympathy towards Russia, for example. They will perhaps be able to formulate the policies together. But I think the ECR group with Giorgia Meloni, I think that's a different type of right wing in terms of its attitudes towards immigration in general, its attitudes towards the conflict in Ukraine, and its attitudes towards Euroscepticism.
Indeed. Sunniva, you've kind of got a ringside seat for all of this because you're our Brussels correspondent. I'm just wondering, what's been the standout moment for you in the campaign trail so far, now that we're so close to the elections actually taking place?
Yeah, I think what you were saying about the far right has been really the most interesting thing to follow. And for me, especially how Marine Le Pen in France broke off with the German far right, as you mentioned. And what's interesting is that the far right is now becoming, in the past, it used to be viewed as very anti-Semitic, and it's managed to change that. And that's actually indirectly kind of linked to the Gaza war. I said earlier, there's not much influence of this, but after the October 7 attacks in France, there was a lot of movement to show that people were against anti-Semitism, because unfortunately across Europe, there was a rise in anti-Semitic attacks as well. And she appeared there for the first time. And then there was also a national homage paid to the French people who died on October 7 in Israel. And France was the only country to do that in the world, even to hold a national ceremony with the President of the Republic to pay tribute to the people who died as an anti-Semitic attack. And again, the far right was there. And those who were the most criticized were the far left. So we really see the far right in France becoming in the mainstream, being strongly pro-Israel, whereas the strongest criticism against the far left for being pro-Hamas and all of this. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And as Justin said, also Ursula von der Leyen, so the lead candidate to become the Commission president again, has not ruled out working with Giorgia Meloni, despite her being labeled far right, because she's actually ended up being quite European friendly and pro-Ukraine. So maybe the far right in France will end up being like her too. It's really interesting to see how this evolves. And I think it sounds a little bit niche when you talk about it, but it's actually, I think, going to be a real trendsetter for the next years in Europe and European politics.
I think what you've said highlights the fact that the Middle East is actually never far away, even in terms of European politics. And turning to Justin again, the European Union is currently the GCC's second biggest trade partner after China, and the Gulf is the European Union's sixth largest export market. What implication do you think elections have for the European and GCC relationship? And could we expect to see a deepening of existing ties?
Ever since the GCC and the EU countries signed the cooperative agreement in 1988, 1989, there's tended to be this gradual kind of deepening. And of course, it's spread out into kind of digital technologies, green technologies, and so forth, sustainability ventures. But principally, the linkages are still very entrenched within the economic sphere. I think within the European elections, will it produce greater level of congruence or partnership between the EU, GCC within security issues? I'm not so sure, to be honest with you. I think security issues are still one of those very thorny issues that states still sometimes just struggle cooperatively on because they feel that their sovereignty might be impinged. But within other areas, I think it will just be business as usual, to be honest with you, and you'll continue to see greater trade ties, touristic ties, and so on. And I think that will continue to be the defining relationship between the EU and the GCC countries.
Okay, I just wanted to ask both of you before we wrap up, is there any topic that you think we should be discussing right now, or anything that I've missed out that you think really should be highlighted as part of this exploration of the European elections?
The understandable trend within European Union politics, of course, is the concern over the far right. But Sunniva touched on an important point earlier about attitudes towards the left. And I know when we think about populist parties within the European Union, we tend to naturally, understandably migrate towards focusing on the far right parties. But of course, we do find left of centre parties, left of centre populist parties in Portugal and, of course, in Greece. So I think, at least from the point of view of European politics, there's also both spectrums that will kind of have some kind of impact, particularly on voters who are interested in kind of green issues, which are perhaps being taken up more by groups like the Party of European Socialists. But the second thing that I guess is important really is the United States in the election later on this year. And I think that will redefine a lot of how the European Union deals with its member states in an intra-European way, but also how it engages with other regions and other entities. I think that will be important, not just for America, but for Europe, for the Middle East, and for the world.
And finally, turning to you, Sunniva, is there anything else that you think is of critical importance in these coming elections?
I think what's interesting to watch is how the EU continues its partnerships with North African countries, because a lot of deals have been struck recently to contain migrants in North Africa, for example, in Tunisia more recently, but also in Lebanon, because a lot of Syrians have been arriving in Cyprus. And so if we see a rise of right and far right parties in the next election, there might be a push to continue these kind of harsher policies towards keeping migrants out. And a final point maybe on the far right and immigration is that they promise, for example, in France, to close the borders when, for example, they say that they can stop non-Europeans from circulating within the Schengen area, but in effect, that's actually illegal. And the leader of the far right in France, Jordan Bardella, had to admit that recently on a live TV debate with Prime Minister Gabriel Attal. He had to say that actually, in effect, that would actually mean more random inspections at the border. They can't actually close the border because you have, for example, a lot of Europeans who work cross borders every day between France and Switzerland, for example. It would be, in effect, impossible to stop these people from crossing the borders and checking if every single person is European or not European. So maybe we'll see more random inspections, but in effect, there's not much they can really do to increase controls at the borders, within Europe, I mean.
Well, clearly there's a lot at stake and a lot more to discuss, but for now, Sunniva Rose for The National in Brussels and Professor Justin Gibbons in Dubai, thank you so much for joining us on the Year of Elections. Thanks a lot for listening. Please follow and subscribe to get all the latest episodes as soon as they come out. This episode was produced by Doa Farid and Arthur Edison, and I'm your host, Declan McVeigh.